to you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, The Reality of Virtual Reality and Its Ability to Scale Immersive Learning. My name is Melissa, and I will be kicking things off for us today. Let's get started with some brief introductions. Our presenters today are Derek Belch, who is the founder and CEO of Striver, Todd Larson, who is the Director of Simulation and Innovative Technologies with Advent Health, and Claude Werder, who is the SVP and Principal HCM Analyst here at Brandon Hall Group. I would like to extend a thank you to Striver for sponsoring today's webinar. The Striver platform was built with a vision to elevate performance through immersive experience. With over 2 million sessions conducted in VR to date, Striver is the platform of choice for Fortune 1000 companies looking to scale VR and build skills across their workforce. Along with a growing ecosystem of partners, Striver is accelerating the adoption of VR in the enterprise and delivering on this vision to bring more powerful learning experiences to the world. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that we currently have several certification programs open for enrollment, including our Certified Learning Strategist program. You can visit certification.brandonhall.com for more information. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components of our research. So if you see any surveys on our schedule that you would like to participate in, it's always greatly appreciated. Links will be available in your handout, and you can always visit brandonhall.com for the latest list. All participants do receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. And last but certainly not least, a few logistics for today. To ask questions, we ask that you please use the questions panel on your control bar. Today's presentation is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be provided to everyone via email in roughly 24 hours. The chat is also open for today, so we invite you to join in on today's discussion, share your thoughts as we go, or simply pop in and say hello and let us know where you're joining in from today. If you would like to download a copy of today's presentation instantly, the link to do so will be available momentarily in the chat. And without any further delay, I'm going to turn things over to Claude so we can dive right in.
Well, great. Thank you, Melissa. And thanks to everybody for coming today. And thanks especially to Striver for sponsoring the webinar. Got a great session for you today. We're going to start with Derek talking a little bit about what virtual reality is and talking about the different types of technology and a little bit introduce you to Striver. Then I'm going to give you a little bit of research on VR and the metaverse in human capital management, particularly in learning. We'll make the business case for more use of VR in learning and hear a great success story from Advent Health based in Florida, which I think is going to give you some great insight on the power of VR. And then we'll leave some time for questions at the end. But in addition, we encourage you to put in comments or questions as we go. As you do that, we may interrupt from time to time to address your comments and questions. And we'll also, like I said, save some time at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Derek to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks, Claude. And good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, based on where you are. I see we already had one question come in, which I'm going to answer here in a second when I do a little bit of an overview. Love that engagement right away. So real quick, before we jump in and talk about kind of some basic education points, I want to just give our background really quick, mainly to establish some credibility with all of you. Who am I and why are you listening to me? Who is Todd? He'll talk about himself in Advent a little later. But real quick, so Striver was founded in 2015. The genesis here actually is I attended Stanford University from 2003 to 2007. I was on the football team. I was a field goal kicker. Those of you who follow college football may know that these were the dark ages of Stanford football. We were really bad those years. We're not very good this year, but we were a lot better in the 10 to 12 years after I left. But nonetheless, it was a great experience. I worked in consulting for a couple of years, and then I ended up going to business school at USC. And while I was in business school, I had this crazy thought: if I don't see coaching before I turn 30, I'm going to regret it forever. So I actually ended up going back to Stanford after finishing my MBA. I did not need another master's at the time, but the only way to get a job on the football staff was to enroll in another graduate program and be a graduate assistant on the team, which basically means you're an officially recognized coach by the NCAA, but you're also in grad school. I coached for 2 years in 2013 and 14, and concurrently with coaching, working 100 hours a week as a coach, I had to do a thesis. And my thesis was to come up with a way to train football players using virtual reality. Long story short, Stanford's head coach, David Shaw, at the end of the 2014 season, basically sat me down and kicked me out of the office and strongly encouraged me to go start a company based off that thesis. He even said, I'd love to write you a check to get you off the ground if you'd be willing to take my money. So I think I'm one of the only people in the world to get fired with a non-severance check for $30,000 that instead was a seed round startup investment. That's literally how Striver started. And as you can see on this slide here, for a good 18 plus months, we were mainly focused on NFL and college football teams, a few other sports here and there. If you can see my screen right now, I'm holding up a VR headset. The whole premise at the time, which really hasn't changed much, and we'll get to this in a little bit, was, I put this headset on my face and my body is off the field, but my brain thinks it's on the field, right? And so we had a lot of success in sports. And then in the summer of 2016, we get this random, lucky phone call from a gentleman named Brock McKeel at Walmart. And he says, hey, I've seen your sports stuff. I'd love to come down and talk to you about employee training. And I went down there pretty much on a whim. And a lot of you that have been following this industry for a while know that Walmart, was kind of the first big splash in the VR space. And here we are 6 years later. And you can see some of our customers here on the slide. Melissa and Claude mentioned this before. We've had over 1 million people put headsets on their faces for training over the last several years. We've had over 2 million different sessions in virtual reality. So as it relates to credibility, I objectively, not arrogantly, there really isn't a better person up here to talk about the good, the bad, and everything in between of VR, and just give you all a really honest, realistic perspective of how this stuff works and what's going on out there, right? And so with that, I want to segue, and the first 5 minutes of this presentation before I turn it over to Claude are really just going to be some educational, / thought leadership. Let's just make sure we're really all on the same page here, right? And to start, I want to differentiate between virtual reality and augmented reality. These are two really big terms. They've been all over the news for several years. Many of you are probably, tinkering or more with these two technologies. They're kind of the building blocks of all things metaverse, which Claude will get to in a little bit. But here you go. So VR, as I mentioned before, is what I like to call complete mental transportation. Body in one place, brain somewhere else, right? And again, if you can see my camera, I'm holding up a Pico device here. It could be any device for that matter, but this is an untethered, all-in-one device. You don't have to connect it to a computer or anything. It's only like $400. And if VR is done well, I should put this headset on right here in my home office, and my brain should think it's somewhere else, right? Now, I say if it's done well, that's really important. A lot of you have probably experienced some sort of nausea when putting a headset on, probably because you played a game or you did a virtual roller coaster at a mall, right? Where your body was sitting in one place, but your brain is moving, down a street or through this roller coaster. That's not VR done well. That will make you sick, right? Think about it. Body in one place, brain thinks it's moving. That messes with your equilibrium, right? So we got to make sure that VR is done well to achieve this second bullet, complete mental transportation. The last thing I want to say, and I'll use this phrase a little bit more later, but remember, VR was not invented 8 years ago, when Facebook, now Meta, bought Oculus. VR has been around for a long time. In the military, flight simulators, you'll see that later. Academic labs, medical, and curing of phobias. It's just been around for a long time. The difference is we are now in the cheaper, lighter, faster era of VR, just like we've seen with computers to laptops and tablets and smartphones and all these other devices, right? So that is VR. All right. Augmented reality is exactly what it sounds like, augmenting the real world around you. Okay. So this could be a pair of glasses. This could be a pilot with a heads-up display. This could be a car windshield, right? One day it'll be our contact lenses, or our eyeballs, like Minority Report. That's kind of scary, but that's probably where this is all going. But again, not complete mental transportation, but augmenting and enhancing the real world around you with digital overlays. Okay. Critical bullet here. Bullet 2, hands-free versus phone-based. All right. Our opinion at Striver, having seen a lot of this out there, as I mentioned before, is hands-free AR is really going to be the in the flow of work tool that everyone is craving and a lot of jobs can really benefit from. Imagine a surgeon or an assembly line worker at Ford, or someone stacking boxes on a shelf, right? They don't want to hold up a phone or a tablet, put it down, hold it up, put it down. What do I do? Put it down, right? They need that in the flow of work, hands-free experience. And I'm not here today to be negative or sobering, but I want to be honest, guys. We're 10 years away from that hands-free Minority Report-like experience. We got a long way to go, not only for the compute power and the glasses like Todd and Claude are wearing right now, but also in the battery life, but also the internet connectivity required to power all this stuff. That's not to say we're never going to get there, right? We will, but we got a long way to go. And so unless you have some very specific use cases that are remote assist oriented or that can be phone-based or tablet-based, our personal opinion is to just monitor AR right now, but and not necessarily go all in, because it's going to improve dramatically, but it's going to take quite a bit of time. All right. And then in closing, I want to just talk, big picture. How's this all going to come together, right? Well, what we like to say at Striver is, if we think about the employee development experience in an organization, there's really 3 fundamental phases: hiring people, training people, and doing the work. And as a result of what I explained earlier, and we'll talk about a little later, we see VR as a very powerful simulation-based learning tool, a very powerful simulation-based assessment tool, right? So we see VR as being fundamentally disruptive and transformative in the hiring and training buckets. And we see AR as that in the flow of work doing technology, right? And Todd will talk a little bit later about data and analytics and some of the stuff admin has been experiencing, but you can certainly imagine a world where we're gathering information about you in the hiring process and what you know and what you don't know. We're refining and tweaking that in the training process, and then we're presenting that information to you in real time, in the doing process, right? The work process. So all of these are going to fit together from a data and analytics standpoint as well over time. But this is how, this is where we see this going with these technologies in the HR and people development space. And lastly, I want to answer this question that came in right now, and then I'm going to turn it over to Claude. The question that came in right away was, when will you be able to train financial analysts? Okay. So I love that this was asked right away. One of the things that we take a lot of pride in at Striver is not doing VR for VR's sake, or AR for AR's sake, XR for XR's sake, right? We really want to focus on the use cases and the concepts and the skill building where these mediums are a really good fit. Again, back to that idea of mental transportation or augmenting the real world around you. And so this question, it's a great question. It's not a bad question. It's a great question. I tend to disagree with Mark Zuckerberg and what they're doing at Meta, right? Or pieces of it. I don't think training financial analysts in VR is the right fit for the technology. I mean, 2D spreadsheets are pretty good, right? I don't think AR is going to make it that much better. I don't think people want to hang out in glasses all day with 9 different screens. Maybe one day in 20 years when it's like your eyeballs, right? But that particular use case of training financial analysts, that's just not the right fit for the technology, right? And this is something that we really, really spend a lot of time on with our customers, educating, talking about ROI. You'll hear about this later, making sure we're spending our time and money in the right place. So I'm really glad that came in right away. It's the perfect way to close out kind of this fundamental education. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to Claude.
Well, thanks, Derek. And we're going to focus more on mostly today on virtual reality in corporate learning. And like Derek said, it has to be the right fit, but there are a lot of really good fits. And the reason we want to really focus on it today and talk to you about it is we think VR is kind of underused in a lot of ways. And our research shows that a majority of organizations believe learning is important to the future of business and the succeeding in the future of work. but only 37% believe learning is well positioned to develop skills needed for the future of work. You know, even today, post-pandemic, most learning continues to be, maybe not most, but a lot of learning still tends to be event-focused. Virtual classrooms overtaken in person, and self-paced e-learning also gets heavy use. And that's, like Derek mentioned, maybe for financial analysts or other types, that's good for some types of learning. But immersive learning is really needed to provide the workforce with the hands-on practice needed to reinforce skills training and create new behaviors and habits in a lot of different areas. Virtual reality is great for this, as Derek's been describing. And he mentioned that, but I'll mention it again, that the military and highly regulated industries, as well as academia, have been doing it for years. So it's not new, it's not experimental. It's well developed and scalable right now. And we're gonna talk to you about that and of course, show you the benefits of it. Just a little bit more data. Our research shows that 85% of organizations believe that it's important to use scenarios or simulations to practice leadership skills and other new skills. Now, there's many ways to do that. Obviously, you can do the live scenario-based simulations. You can do simulations through virtual learning on Zoom and such, but virtual reality provides a much richer, realistic experience, especially in certain situations. But when we ask organizations about important technology to address future of work requirements, we have 63% mentioning learning experience platforms and 55% say simulation, 42% mention gaming, but only 31% is shown on the slide here, cite virtual reality. And at the same time, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, almost 2/3 of organizations express enthusiasm for the future of learning in the metaverse, which is of course based on virtual reality-based gaming experiences. So what that tells us is there are some misconceptions about VR, particularly around scalability and cost, that we want to address today. But first, we want to ask you a couple of quick poll questions, get a sense of where all you stand on virtual reality, and that'll help us as we continue with the presentation. So the first question is very simple. Have you ever used a VR headset ever? Not necessarily for learning, but playing a game, getting a demo in a museum, any place that you've just at least tried it once. But just a simple answer, yes or no. Just, I know, Derek, I think you've asked this question before, and I think the answer kind of depends on the audience, right? And
yeah,
what people have experienced. So we'll be interested to see what these folks have to say.
Yeah, and I've been doing this for a long time, as you saw. And 8 years ago, it was 2 out of every 100 people raised their hands. And today it's usually 60 to 70%. So I'm interested. Here we go.
Here we go. 76% say yes.
Yep. Great.
So that's great. Let's move right on to the next one. And that is, hold on a second.
Yeah, it's on there.
Yep, sorry. And so what's your experience in your organization with virtuality for training or learning? So a few different answers here to choose from. Please choose one. You've been using it across the organization for a while. Maybe you've been using it in parts of the organization, maybe, but not the entire organization. You're just getting started, just discussing it. You plan to do it, but you haven't done it yet. Maybe you're going to explore the use in the next couple of years. Or you just don't see virtual reality as being a good option for learning for you. So it'd be really interesting to see where you are. Like I said, I think that helps us with the context of what we're going to talk about today. So we look forward to people weighing in. And let's see. But very few people don't think it's a good option. 48%, just under half, plan to explore it in the next couple of years. But we've only got about 17% who've either used it across the organization for a while or in certain parts of the organization. And 28%, which probably explains why you're attending the webinar, are just getting started and want to learn more. So that's great information, and we thank you for sharing. And so let's let's continue on. We'll talk just a couple minutes about the metaverse. So, before the polls, I mentioned the metaverse. Derek mentioned the metaverse. Gotten an awful lot of attention, right? And metaverses are immersive 3D digital worlds based on virtual reality gaming experience. So obviously virtual reality is at its core. And it's not new. Millions, perhaps billions, play VR-driven video games, all sorts of uses. So in theory, the metaverse works by allowing an infinite number of people to synchronously connect together in real time in an always-on virtual environment. It's immersive, it's three-dimensional, connects to our physical world in several ways. In reality, as Derek touched on, it's tricky technologically. Such a thing requires enormous amounts of computer processing and advancements made in smartphone, gaming device, and VR and AR headset technology. And yet, as we move to the next slide, when we asked research respondents earlier this year about the metaverse and its potential for human capital management, I was surprised that 64% said the metaverse has great potential and we should start preparing right now, even though full adoption, could be years away. However, as I mentioned, about only half that many say VR is an important technology for addressing future of learning requirements. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there that we want to bridge. So on the next slide, just one final set of statistics on the potential of the metaverse. And when we asked about it, 61% said the metaverse could lead to better and faster outcomes. 60% said it could improve employee experiences. 57% said it could drive better collaboration, innovation, and creativity. And as we've talked about, VR is at the core of the metaverse, and it can really deliver this kind of business impact that we're talking about on this slide right now. And so now we want to bring in Todd from Advent Health based in Florida. Todd and his team, along with Striver, have really embraced the use of VR. It's getting some exciting results from it. We want to hear from him and to show you how it can be used perhaps in your organization to go forward. Todd?
Thanks, Claude. So I'm Todd Larson. I am the Director of Simulation and Innovative Technologies here at Advent Health. I'm a registered nurse and I have my master's in IT project management. And we've been working down this journey for 3+ years, even through the pandemic. So it's been a bit of a challenge to implement over the course of the last several years. A little bit about Advent Health. We're a nonprofit healthcare system. We're now 51 hospitals in 9 states. We have 80,000 plus employees, 73 skilled nursing homes, and we have urgent care centers all over the Orlando area. And we serve about 5 million patients a year, and we have about 10,000 plus hospital beds throughout these 9 states. We've been working on this journey for a while, and being an expert in simulation, I look for ways to engage our learners any way we can. And I thought VR was a way we could reproduce training that's consistent, and we can push it across our system in our hospital in an efficient way. And it was a safe means to acquire skills, because we don't want to be practicing on real patients if we don't have to. So to be able to do this and to engage people in virtual reality was something that was very appealing to me and to my team. So if we can move to the next slide, please, and I'll kind of give you a little background. So we started looking for potential topics that we could do for training based on what we found through what we have what we call Patient Safety Academy. And they look at problems that we're currently having and potential problems that we could have in the future. And that really helps us target where we need to focus our training efforts. So that was a great place for us to start and address some current issues. And one of those current issues that we were seeing, and it was recommended by our Patient Safety Academies, was to look at procedural sedation in a number of areas. But we focused on a few procedural units. The first one is the cardiac cath lab. The second one was our interventional radiology suite. And our third ones were our emergency departments. And that encompassed a good number of learners across our Central Florida division. And we thought that was a really good place for us to start. If you move on to the next slide, please, that would be great. So we sat down and we did some discovery, and we talked to the different educators in these units, and we said, hey, how would a VR solution work for you guys? Do you see this as something that we could implement in your unit? And they were very positive about it. So we looked at some of the problems they were having, and the initial problem that we noticed was everybody was doing training differently in these three areas. Now, there's a standard of practice across the country on how we should be pushing out sedation training and the way it should be delivered and practiced on a patient. But we had all three areas just doing their own thing. And so we had no consistency in our training methodology whatsoever. So throughout the course of our discovery in developing content for this, we came up with our business, our program objectives, and our learning objectives. And, and simply monitor the patient, administer the anesthetic agents, as prescribed based on the assessment of the patient. And so after we developed all of that content, we moved on to the pilot, which we finished in May. And if you move on to the next slide, we'll give you a quick overview. So in a month's time, we ran through 367 learners at 4 different hospitals here in the Orlando area, in 3 of the clinical areas I just mentioned. And we trained both new and experienced nurses. So we had some comparison there to see if our experienced nurses were performing the way they should be and how they compared to our new nurses and how well our training was working. So right now we are talking about scaling from this and pushing out to all of our hospitals in the Orlando and Central Florida area, which is about 15 facilities. So we're in the process of moving beyond the pilot, and we've presented to the clinical learners all of the data that we gathered during this effort. Next slide, please. So how effective is this? So we asked our nurses after training how they felt and if they felt prepared to handle a real life scenario after this training, and overwhelmingly 84%. It's like, wow. We knew it was going to be popular, but we didn't know it would be this popular and this engaging. Next slide, please. We also asked some other questions. Was this an effective way to train? Did they like training in the VR headset? And the answer was 88% said, yes, we like doing it this way. We had about 80% of the people that would like to continue using VR. And we had 85% that just, enjoyed this much more than death by PowerPoint or going to a formal class. So these are off the chart numbers that we didn't really expect. And what it's done is we got a big long line waiting for people that want to do VR training. But we also looked at confidence level. How confident are you to assess the patient, which was one of our goals. 88% felt very confident after the training. 87% felt confident in administering the medications and monitoring our patients. So having these kinds of numbers was very, very encouraging for us. And it really met our goals as far as leveling practice. So we are training the same way across our system in these 3 clinical areas. And we're going to use this as an annual competency measure to look at how well our nurses are performing year to year. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, Todd, let's go back before we move on.
Sure.
We had a couple of questions come in while you were talking that I was watching. I'm going to aggregate them. A lot of people have asked about other data, ROI metric, et cetera. And we'll get there on some of my stuff in a minute, but in going through this journey with you over a few years, right? It's not like we were coming into a situation where 8 out of 10 patients were dying because procedural sedation wasn't done the right way. So very similar to pilots flying planes. Like, there's a baseline safety level element here, right? So that's a good thing, right? It's not broken, thank God, in the hospital.
It wasn't broken.
But I want to aggregate these questions and sum it up, for you and have you talk about, okay, so you've got, did they like it or not training? You've got confidence level training. How else, is Advent thinking about measurement? more from a doing new and innovative things and presenting information standpoint than, well, we have so many fewer patients having this being done the right way, because that was already in a pretty good spot, right? But I think it's more of an innovation and an ROI challenge than a keeping people alive challenge. Can you just talk more about that?
Well, I mean, you can just start real simple with scaling. If I have to train a bunch of people, how do I do that?
Yeah.
And physically putting all of our practitioners and breaking them out of the clinical areas to train them in a classroom just isn't practical nowadays. So how do we deliver it? Well, we deliver a lot in web-based training, and a lot of hospital systems do that across the country. But we needed something a little bit more engaging that would tell us if they were ready to go and practice on a real patient. So we would do preliminary training in our web-based training modules across our Adventist Learning Network. Once they complete that, then they would get into the headset, and then we would determine based on their score in the headset if they're ready to move on to the real patient. If they're not, then we were, based on their score in the headset, we were able to target where their areas of need are, or educational need is. So it's like maybe they didn't do so well in assessment. So that unit-based educator could look at the individual learner and go, hey, we need to work more on your assessment skills before we can move on to a real patient. So we would give them exercises and remediate their training in that way. So being able to target different areas and see this in real time with VR has been very, very positive for us. So,
before we move on, we've gotten a lot of questions and comments, and thank you, and we'll get to as many as we can. One I think might be good to handle now is Todd, is Rick writes that he's on board with using VR for training. His question is, where do you get the VR experiences that people are trained with? Do you write the software, or are there templates someplace where an organization can create VR learning experiences?
So in our case, for this particular module, being director of simulation has its advantages in that we have our cadre of our own, what we call standardized patient actors. So we used our standardized patient actors. We used our facilities to film this in 360 video, and that's the way it's delivered. And we wrote the scenarios based on actual case studies that our subject matter experts pulled from each clinical area. So it was the same experience that they would go through in a clinical environment based on information we pulled from patient records. And then we built the scripts ourselves, did the rehearsals, and then Striver came out with their film crew, and we filmed all 3 scenarios.
Yeah, just to follow up on that real quick, we're I think big picture, everyone, we're not yet in a world where there's thousands and thousands of off-the-shelf VR modules available like we see in the 2D learning world, right? We're not there yet. So a lot of the simulation, a lot of the content that's built is built custom to that customer and is built from scratch. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute with Striver specifically. But yeah, as Todd said, we roll up our sleeves together and built this module in partnership with Advent, and that's kind of where we are right now in the industry. And there's some other questions about costs and stuff too that are great. We'll get there in about 10 minutes. So
maybe just one more related to what Todd was talking about, then we'll move on. Todd, what were your biggest challenges rolling out the VR to the various remote locations?
Well, the biggest challenge for us, quite frankly, was COVID. So as we were working through this, all of these clinical areas, and our nursing staff was very much engaged in taking care of COVID patients. So all of our cath lab nurses, our emergency room nurses, which you can imagine, they were very busy, and our interventional radiology nurses, they were all busy taking care of COVID patients. So that put a big barrier in front of us, and we worked through it, and we got there. Other challenges are we had to educate the unit-based educators on this technology, how it would be delivered and scaled out across our network. And that went very smooth. In this particular case, since we had 3 different areas of practice, everybody wanted to do things their own way. So as we were developing this content together, there was some negotiating, and we had to really go back to what's the national standard. And that was kind of our go-to if we couldn't come come up with an agreement between the different practice areas. Largely everything is based on policy and the way we drive policy across our hospital network. So policy trumped everything, and our policy is based and written by experts and based on the national standards.
Great. Okay, we're going to try to get as many of these questions, but we'll turn it back over to Derek now, and then
Awesome.
we'll spend as much time at the end as we can.
Thank you. Great. Awesome questions, guys. Appreciate it. All right. So we're going to conclude, we're going to talk about Striver specifically, and candidly, this is not intended to be a sales pitch. If I think our track record speaks for itself. You know where to find us if you want to work with us. Really what I want to illustrate here, aside, in addition to educating about us a little more specifically, is I want to give the audience, I want to give you the roadmap. I want to give you the keys, right? There's no secrets in this space of how to be successful. I want to put it all out there for you. So if you want to work with us, awesome with what I walk through. If not, then use the next 5 minutes to really think about how you are going to evaluate other vendors and partners, how you're going to communicate with your own stakeholders internally, right? So that's really the goal here is, 80% thought leadership, 20% Striver. So, first off, this is the problem we're solving at Striver. I think Todd referenced this. Death by PowerPoint is real. Information in one ear and out the other is real. And we want to bring a new, more innovative, more engaging learning experience to your employees where it makes sense, as we mentioned earlier, right? There's areas where e-learning still definitely makes sense, for sure. There's areas where doing it in the real world still makes sense. But certainly this is the problem that we're trying to solve. As I mentioned earlier, we're now in the cheaper, lighter, faster era. This is a 2,000-year-old quote, and VR has a chance to be the learning by doing technology. And then lastly, before we jump into some specifics about Striver, again, always be thinking about this metaphor, right? A pilot going through a flight simulator. So what are those moments? What are those learning in their real jobs? What are those learning opportunities in onboarding or continuing education, or whatever it is, where we want to put our employees through a flight simulator-like experience, right? Where there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to that learning. And as Todd mentioned as well, ideally we can have a score that tells if they're ready to go on to the next phase of their job or to do it in the real world or whatever it is, right? So a flight simulator-like experience is what we're shooting for with VR all the time, all right? I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the interest of time. So super important, this is Striver specifically, but again, big picture, this is a software challenge. To do this at scale is a software challenge. All right. So Striver, yes, we have made content for Advent and our other customers. We have to do stuff with the hardware. We're not a hardware company, but we have to do a lot with it. But we are really a software company at our core. And if you're going to scale VR in your organization, you need to be working with vendors and partners that have an actual software offering to do this at scale. And again, what I mean by this is we are obsessed with scale. All right, we have over 20,000 devices in the field right now. I mentioned earlier, we've trained over 1 million people. Okay, Walmart put this on the map back in 2018. B of A was in the news last year, and they're humming, which is awesome, right? And I want to take a minute and just walk through software and services to make this happen, okay? So first off, think of software as the plumbing and infrastructure needed to deploy VR at scale, right? So here's our software platform. And again, there's lots of other vendors out there. We're happy to be a resource to help you evaluate them if you'd like, if we're not the right fit for you. But you got to make sure you're working with a company that has a real software platform. Okay, so here's ours. Ours has two sides to it, a content creation side and a U side, the end user, the customer. So on the left, we have created a suite of different products and tools that enable VR content creation. Todd mentioned earlier, Advent had a lot of stuff that we could leverage, actors and subject matter experts and physical locations. Awesome. Striver brought some camera folks and some instructional designers and the software to build this module, and boom, there we go. It's built a couple months later, right? So all things content creation. We've recently rolled out an SDK, a software development kit, to allow you to work with any third-party content vendor and put it on the platform. Awesome, great. The right side is all things you. what does your associate, what does your employee see when they put on the headset, the UI, the UX, the look and feel, etc.? What does the portal look like where you get all your data and analytics? What does the content management system look like? On and on. And then in the middle, the least sexy but most important thing on this slide is all things platform infrastructure, data and compliance, getting on a corporate network, encryption testing and pen testing, SSO, cloud management, on and on and on. The list is very long. We had a question that came in. What's one of the biggest challenges for scale? I'm going to answer that right now. We'll talk about ROI a little later, but the biggest challenge for scale is doing a VR pilot in a dark corner in the basement, or with the innovation team not talking to any other business units, and then it goes so well, like Todd highlighted, you want to scale, and then your IT team hands you a year-long checklist of work you got to do, right? Like that is just an immediate buzzkill to scale, right? So working with a vendor, a partner, pulling the legal and IT process up early in your process, super, super important. Okay, so this is our platform. And then Todd alluded to this earlier, this is how the services work. We're always doing some form of strategy and alignment with our customers. In step one, this is an example of strategy alignment right now. You're educating, you're learning. All right, what should I do? What should I not do in VR? Steps 2, 3, and 4 are all about content creation. Step 5 is the setup and provisioning of devices. Someone asked about hardware earlier. As of today, VR is still mainly a consumer technology from a hardware perspective. So we actually have a warehouse at Striver, and we run all these devices through an assembly line, and we turn them into enterprise devices before we send them out to you, right? Rollout and adoption, change management. Todd mentioned this before, getting folks aligned that are used to administering 2D and in-person training, teaching them how to use VR, right? And making that scalable within your own organization. And then lastly, the performance analysis, the data analytics, the ROI. So that is just a really quick overview of how we operate, at Striver. And again, partly, hey, here's what we do, but mainly really want to be an educational resource for all of you to be thinking through all of this stuff as you're selecting vendors, as you're picking partners, as you're aligning, dotting I's and crossing T's in your own organization. And lastly, on step 7, perfect segue to Todd, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the possibilities that VR allows from a data perspective, and add some Advent data specifically as you go deeper into the possibilities here with immersive analytics. And then I'll wrap us up with one more slide on use cases. Todd?
Thanks, Derek. So the nice thing about VR and building your scenarios is you can measure everything that's going on within that headset. And we really looked at the heat map technology that's part of the analytics piece that Striver provided us. And we really wanted to know when the clinician was participating in the learning, where was their focus? And was it on the patient? Were they looking at the ground? Were they looking at the monitor? Was it a combination of a couple of different things? And we were pleasantly surprised that, our nurses were focusing on the right things. Sometimes they made the right decision, sometimes they didn't, but we wanted to make sure that they were focused and engaged and looking in the right areas. And if they're not, then we obviously wanted to fix that problem down the road. And that's what's so great about a pilot. You have a lot of information coming at you, and you can look at that information and figure out what you're doing well and what you're not doing so well. Next slide, please. We were also very intentional about putting distractions in there. Noises, surgeons talking, surgeons being belligerent, doctors being belligerent, patients not responding the way they should be, monitor noise in the background. All of these impact your decision-making when you're in a clinical environment. And we wanted to make sure that the distractions were something they're going to see every day in their clinical practice. So we did all that, and we were very intentional when we designed each scenario. And when we looked at the data on the back end, we found that, hey, our nurses aren't assessing as well on what we call a RAS scale like they should have been. So what did we do? We changed our web-based training to be more intentional about focusing on assessment. So when they do get in the headset, they're more conscious of it, and they're able to repeat that more safely and readily than they were actually during the pilot. And I know the question is going to come up, and I'm kind of trying to watch the chat here out of the corner of my eye, and I'll let Derek speak to it as well. But everybody brings up VR sickness, And we had about 1 to 2% of our nurses get sick. They were troopers. They went through the entire thing, but knowing that, we put in a 2D solution that we have as part of our web-based training. It's based on everything that we film. The scenario is exactly the same, but we do offer a 2D solution that'll allow our practitioners to go in and complete the training if they can't handle the VR headset. Derek?
Yeah. Thanks, Todd. Yeah. And super important on that last topic, in general, we tell people with all the research coming out of Stanford, where we were founded, if you can be a passenger in a car without getting sick, you can probably, wear a headset, you'll be just fine. And that's, as Todd said, that's usually, 98% of people. And then lastly, if the content is built correctly, connecting the dots all the way back to the beginning, and you choose the right hardware, and you do not move people through a scene, right? And you have them sitting at the right time, standing at the right time, et cetera, people shouldn't get sick. It should be in that, 1 to 2% range. And that's something that we've seen very consistent across all of our other customers. I saw, we just saw someone write 1 in 4. I mean, 1 in 4 is really high. I would question the content there and how it was built, and maybe how the frame rates are calibrated, and a lot of other things. That's pretty high. Normally, we've seen our customers in that 1 to 2% range, as Todd said. And like I said, we've had over 1 million people put headsets on, actually put headsets on over the last 6 to 7 years, not watch stuff on a 2-dimensional screen. So in closing, before we go more to Q&A in the last 10 minutes, I just want to close by talking about use cases. So we always get the question, what are customers doing? What are people doing in this industry? And here you go. Here's the money slide that is most often photographed at conferences and in meetings. Here's 90% of what the market's doing right now. Striver customers, no different. You've got 4 buckets here. Each of them has a range that I'll just walk through really quickly. So bucket 1, operations, process, procedures, right? And so the range here is, on one side of the spectrum, you've got like situational awareness. The first thing that Walmart ever did was Black Friday training for store managers, right? They're assessing the scene. They're getting used to that environment, the chaos that is their Super Bowl, once a year, right? Todd, some of the stuff that we did with nurses for procedural sedation is more about situational awareness than actually using your hands. Other parts of it are more specific, right? So that's one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum is step-by-step, process-oriented, building a car in virtual reality, administering an IV, putting boxes on a shelf, right? So that's your range there. Situational awareness to step-by-step, actually doing the task, right? Task-oriented operations. Middle bucket, health and safety. Again, the range. Far left side, simple stuff. Slips, trips, and falls in a factory, a spill in aisle 5, all the way to active shooter and everything, store robberies and everything in between, right? That's the range with health and safety. Third bucket, all things customer service, interacting with customers, good customer service, bad customer service, de-escalation, dealing with unruly customers. This has been a huge one the last few years with political unrest, social unrest, mask mandates, et cetera. This is a big one. So that's the third bucket. And then lastly, all things soft skills and interpersonal skills is the last use case. And this is, at least in the HR community, that bottom bucket is one of the most popular inbounds that we get at Striver. Now, in closing, before we shift entirely to Q&A, I want to answer one of the questions that came in again, and that was that scale question. So we talked earlier about IT and aligning with other business units from the beginning, and not having this be in a deep, dark corner, from an innovation perspective, but having it be part of the organization from day one. The other thing that's really important for scale is this slide, is picking a use case that has ROI attached to it, that has universal applicability attached to it. Using ADV as an example, this procedural sedation module and this group of nurses, these people are at every hospital across the AdVet network. This is something that every nurse needs to do, right? Todd, correct me if I'm wrong. Every nurse needs to do this. Todd mentioned the scalability challenges. Hey, we don't have any way to train people before they go do it live on a person. I want it consistent. I want it scalable, right? So This had a hard dollar ROI attachment and a soft dollar ROI attachment for Advent. And so the best way to avoid some of those roadblocks is to scale is picking the right use case up front that has real ROI attached to it. And as an example, not to be a downer for everyone, but just to be honest, the soft skills bucket at the bottom, while really important in every organization, we have a leadership coach at Striver that we've been using for 5 years. I'm a huge believer in soft skills. Soft skills are really difficult to quantify from an ROI perspective, really difficult. I think we all know what I'm talking about there in our own world. So my recommendation to this audience is to start, as Advent did, start somewhere in the top 3 buckets where you can have a really solid ROI, bulletproof ROI business case, and have that be what builds your library and what justifies funding and ROI for scale. And then have your soft skills be use cases and content be your library fillers, right? Have those be the things that force multiply VR across the organization that can be for frontline workers and knowledge workers, and everyone in between, right? So that's my answer to that roadblocks to scale question. We talked about IT and all things, data and infrastructure, and then also this ROI component from the beginning is super, super important. And with that, we'll move to Q&A. Claude, I don't know if you're going to MC this or you just want me to jump in.
I can take it, and you guys can jump in if you want. Let's start with maybe some of the more nuts and bolts questions that people are coming up with. Kelly asked, and a couple of other people asked a similar question about what kind of time and effort are involved in initial training of actually using the VR equipment before you actually do the training in VR.
Yeah, so I'll speak, generically from a Striver perspective, and then Todd, please give us specifics with Advent. So typically, listen, this is not that much different than some other learning initiatives and other e-learning and workshop type things. Typically low end 7 to 8 weeks, high end 12 to 16 weeks, depending on how much you need to go get approvals in your own organization to build the content, right? So you're looking at 7 to 12 to 16 weeks to build the content. Certainly when off-the-shelf content is more plentiful, that will be a lot faster. But you're looking at that 7 to 12 to 16 week timeframe to build content. And then from a readiness of use and usability and ease of use perspective to the other part of the question, listen, Todd can jump in here. We take this very seriously at Striver. We know that, especially in a frontline worker world like nurses and Walmart employees and bank tellers, and you don't have a lot of time for these people. So we pride ourselves in that software UI component being headset on face, and what you're doing in 60 to 90 seconds. We want the headset on and they're going, right? But Todd can specifically talk about some things that Advent has done. And Todd, please feel free to also verify that I'm not BSing everyone with what we say there,
So we were very intentional about it, and obviously that's something that we considered from the very beginning. We knew we were going to have unit-based educators that were very familiar with technology, and this wouldn't intimidate them. Then we would have our older group that would be much more intimidated with it. So we built a web-based training module for them to introduce them to the technology, and then we went around and trained educators at all 4 sites, so they could put their hands on the headset, go through the experience, ask us lots of questions. We would do different things to the headset where they would have to troubleshoot it. So they were very comfortable with the headsets when we started running the greater group through. So, and it paid off for us. We had very, very few issues through the pilot at all.
Todd, just as a follow-up, Gary asked for immersive equipment training. Is there need to have 3D design file for that?
We did. I mean, we did the web-based training in 2D, and then we did hands-on training with the unit-based educators for each of these areas at all 4 facilities. That was about, just to give you an idea, so we ran, close to 400 people through in a month, and we trained about 40 facilitators. So
we got a couple questions about the number of headsets. Mai was wondering if she understood correctly that you're using 5 VR headsets per location, and how does that work when you're training hundreds of people, and what's kind of the formula for what you need?
We scheduled everything within our web-based training modules or within our LMS. So they were scheduled times. Unit-based educators could go in and grab people for training if they wanted to, if there were gaps in the time. But for the most part, all the employees scheduled their training. They came in, did their training, and left. It was as simple as that. We ran the numbers like everybody would. We tried to strategically place headsets in different areas where they were being used the most. We had a couple in the emergency department. We had one in our interventional suite because it's not as busy as the cath lab in the emergency room. So it was usually a 2-1-2 kind of scenario. And then as we finished training in some of the other sites, we started migrating headsets over to other facilities if they needed them. But it went very smooth. I was pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, and just to jump in on this one too, I think this is important. We are, I think there's a misconception out there that you need one headset per person. I mean, that's going to add up real fast from a cost perspective, and that's certainly what Meta is pushing with their device. And I think that's years away. The justification there from a cost perspective, and knowledge workers like all of us having a laptop, a phone, a tablet, a headset. We're not there yet. But in Todd's world, and in the world of a lot of you with more of a frontline worker use case, maybe where there's a store or a hospital or a restaurant or a warehouse or whatever it is, you don't need a headset per person. They had 5 and they had scheduled training time. And after each person used it, they wipe it down, they sanitize it, they clean it, it sits there for a day. The next person comes in, right? I mean, this was all during COVID too, and everything was fine. So, Walmart has had 4 headsets per store for the last 5 years. Bank of America has 1 headset per bank right now at all the banks. We've had other customers. Someone asked about onboarding earlier. Other customers have 20 headsets in their onboarding room, and group 1 comes in, everyone puts one on, does the deal. They go out, group 2 comes in, everyone puts, so like you don't necessarily have to break the bank here from a hardware perspective. But again, back to that 7-step model, this is what we do in step 1, strategy. We walk through all this stuff and make sure we're doing more than just building a piece of content and having fun. We're doing this, right? Just in the same way you would put your laptops and your phones and your tablets out there. So great question, really important.
We got time for a couple more. Let's switch to assessment. Got a couple around the assessment of skill with VR technology. Does it eliminate the need for a human assessor, or is the data and the assessment capability of VR more supplementary?
I want to field that question because, in healthcare, particularly running a simulation center, we always run into the objectivity piece. Can the instructor be truly objective? The nice thing in VR is it's completely objective. It is what it is. If you answered the question the correct way, you got it right. If you executed the scenario in the right manner, you got it correct. There's no gray area there. There's nobody to debate with. It is what it is. When I run frequent live simulations here, I always run into that inter-rater reliability question between evaluators. I run into, the instructor didn't like me, so that's why I got a bad score. That all goes away in VR. It's completely gone.
And then we had a couple of questions kind of related around, is the VR training as designed, is it sufficient so that learners should be able to be self-reliant upon completion of the training? In other words, I think, do you need to have follow-up training or reinforcement training, or depending on the kind of training you're doing, are they ready to go in your mind?
I think it depends on the kind of training you're doing. In the case of sedation, we did preliminary training via web-based training module. So we used a blended training experience. So they do their modules in our learning management system. They complete those modules. Then we use the experiential piece, the VR piece, to see if they're ready to go on to practice on a real patient. Basically, it's a safety assessment. Are you competent and safe to practice? And if the answer is yes to that, then they move on with their preceptor and they practice on a real patient, and then the preceptor will qualify them that they're ready to go. Now that's based on the type of training you're doing. In some cases, the headset might be good enough to validate that they're ready to go. But in this case, we didn't take that approach.
All right, we just got, we're actually right at time, but let's take one more question. There's been a few about cost, and Derek, if you can address that real quick.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And we'll wrap this up. So great question. Listen, here's the deal on costs, as many of you have probably experienced. To do a pilot, to do a test, you can pay anything from $0 to a 2-person startup that wants your logo on their website to $500,000 based on exactly what you're trying to build, the size and scale of the deployment, the complexity of the content, et cetera, right? I would say most pilots right now, to get a piece of content built, to get 5 to 10 headsets out there, et cetera, are somewhere in the $100,000 to $250,000 range. I think that's a pretty safe bet for all pilots in the industry. Striver no different. Again, could be a little less, could be a little more based on exactly what you want. And then doing it at scale, again, there's a range, right? It depends on how many headsets you want out there. It depends on how many locations and people are going to go through this. It depends on how much more content you're going to build. I'll just tell you very candidly at Striver, we have one customer paying us $27,500 a year, and we have one customer paying us $5.2 million a year, and everything in between, right? Based on size and scale of organization. So, there's your answer on all things cost.
Well, that's a good place to cut it off. I want to thank Derek and Todd. Great job, and especially the audience. Great questions, great comments. We hope we got to most of the questions. I think we did, at least at a high level. Thanks everyone for taking the time. I know you're very busy. Really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day and rest of the week. Thanks again to Striver for sponsoring, and we'll catch you on another webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.